All right, so today, let's imagine, okay, you're getting ready for like a big meeting about the Caribbean, tourism investments, whatever. And then, bam, there's this alert tropical storm, Rafael.
Oh, wow.
In November. That's kind of unusual, right? That's why we're doing this deep dive today. You sent over this article about it, and it's got some pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's what's really interesting is the uncertainty around it.
Okay.
It just formed in the Caribbean, and the forecast is saying it could become a hurricane pretty quickly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's supposed to hit Cuba, maybe even as a Category 2 hurricane.
Wow.
And then after that, it heads into the Gulf of Mexico. And that's where things get really interesting.
So we've got a potential hurricane, but we don't really know where it's going yet. The article mentioned the U.S. Gulf Coast, but also maybe Mexico. What makes it so hard to tell where it's headed?
Well, predicting a hurricane's path, especially one that's as new as Rafael, is kind of like like trying to figure out where a leaf is going to land when it falls from a tree in a windy day.
Oh.
It's just, there's so many things going on.
Right.
Plus, it's still really early, like it's days away from even reaching the Gulf Coast.
Wow.
And that makes a big difference for people who live in those areas.
Right. So while we wait to see what Rafael does, let's talk about what we do know, starting with the Caribbean. The article makes it sound pretty bad. Heavy rainfall, possible flooding, especially in like Jamaica, Cuba, Haiti, the Cayman Islands.
Yeah, the rainfall is really what's worrying me.
Yeah.
We're looking at like 3 to 6 inches generally, but some areas could get way more than that.
Oh, wow.
Especially like the mountains in Jamaica.
Yeah.
Think about all of that rain plus mountains, landslides.
Oh, yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And the article talked about the wind, too.
Yeah.
Jamaica, Cuba, Cayman Islands. Even the Florida Keys could see some really strong winds, maybe even hurricane force.
Right. And those kinds of winds can do a lot of damage, down trees, power outages, and structural damage to buildings.
Right.
Plus, there's the storm surge. Have you heard of that? It's basically the ocean rising because of the hurricane's winds. Western Cuba could see up to 9 feet of surge.
9 feet.
Yeah. And even the Florida Keys could get some saltwater flooding.
That's scary. Okay, so the Caribbean is definitely facing some serious threats. What about the U.S. Gulf Coast? The article mentions it, but it seems a lot less certain.
Yeah, the Gulf Coast is kind of in wait-and-see mode right now. If Rafael does reach the Gulf Coast, which could be later this weekend, then its intensity and where it goes will depend a lot on a couple things. Cuba's terrain and the wind patterns over the Gulf.
The article said those things could actually weaken the storm. How does that work?
So picture Cuba like a big speed bump for the hurricane.
Okay.
The mountains there can mess up its circulation, make it less organized, and maybe even weaken it. It's like trying to roll a bowling ball across a bumpy field. It loses its momentum.
I see.
And then the wind patterns over the Gulf, especially the high altitude ones, can either make it stronger or tear it apart.
Oh, wow.
So Rafael could become a major hurricane, but it could also weaken a lot before it even gets to the U.S.
So Cuba and the Gulf's winds are kind of acting like a shield for us.
It's possible, yeah, but it's still too early to tell, for sure. And even if it weakens, it could still bring a ton of rain to the Gulf Coast. Plus, its circulation could actually cause more rain before it even gets there.
So that would increase the flooding risk even more.
Exactly.
This is a lot for people on the Gulf Coast to deal with. They don't know where it's going or how strong it'll be when it gets there.
And that's exactly why staying informed and being prepared is so important, especially this late in hurricane season.
That's right. Speaking of late in the season, it's November. You don't usually hear about hurricanes in November, do you?
You're right. November hurricanes are pretty rare. The Atlantic hurricane season technically goes until November 30th. But almost all hurricanes, 98% of them actually make landfall before November.
So why is November so quiet usually?
It's all about what makes hurricanes in the first place.
Yeah.
You need warm ocean water, at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit. By November, the ocean in the main hurricane zones starts to cool down a lot, so it's much harder for storms to form.
It's like the ocean's fuel tank is running low by November.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Rafael is showing us that even though it's less likely, a late-season hurricane can still happen.
Nature always finds a way to surprise us, huh? The article also mentioned 2 very different models for Rafael's path in the Gulf. One shows it going northwest towards the U.S., and the other shows it turning west and maybe missing us altogether. What makes those models disagree so much?
That's a great question. It gets to the heart of how we predict these big weather events.
Okay, so what are these models looking at when they're trying to figure out where a hurricane is going?
Think of them like really complicated computer programs that are constantly crunching numbers to simulate the atmosphere. They look at things like air pressure, temperature, wind speed, and direction, humidity, even the shape of the land.
So they're creating a virtual reality of the storm's world and seeing how it plays out.
Exactly. But there's a catch.
Yeah.
Even with all that data and computing power, they're still just models.
Yeah.
They're not perfect.
So even with all of that information, they can still be wrong.
Yep. Especially for storms like Rafael that are brand new and still days away from land. The further out you try to predict, the harder it gets. Think of it like trying to guess where a pool ball will go after you hit it. If there are only a few balls on the table, it's easier. But if it's crowded, it's way harder to predict.
That's a good way to put it. So in this case, we have two models using the same data, but coming to different conclusions about where the storm might go. Why is that?
It probably comes down to little differences in how each model is interpreting the data and what it thinks is most important. Like one model might focus more on the air currents, while another might focus more on how the storm interacts with Cuba's mountains. And those small differences can lead to big changes in the predicted path.
So which model is right?
That's the million-dollar question, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer. Both models are based on science and use tons of data, but they're making different assumptions. That's where human expertise comes in. Meteorologists use their knowledge of hurricanes, their experience with the models, and their understanding of the weather to decide which forecast is most likely.
So it's not just about following the computer, it's about using human judgment too.
Exactly. And in Rafael's case, it seems like the experts are leaning towards the model that shows it heading northwest towards the U.S. But they're also saying to be ready for anything.
So people along the Gulf Coast really need to be on high alert, even though Rafael might not even head their way.
Exactly. Being prepared is the best way to handle this uncertainty.
One more thing from the article really caught my attention. It mentioned Rafael could spawn tornadoes, especially in the Florida Keys. Now, I always thought tornadoes were more of a land thing. How can a hurricane out at sea create tornadoes over land?
It's a pretty cool process, actually. It all comes down to how the hurricane's rain bands interact with the land.
Rain bands.
Yeah, those are basically like spinning bands of thunderstorms that extend out from the center of the storm.
Okay.
As the hurricane gets close to land, those rain bands can create the perfect conditions for tornadoes.
So it's the clash between the hurricane's energy and the land that triggers these tornadoes.
Exactly. And those tornadoes can be just as dangerous as the ones that form in the middle of the country. Packing winds over 100 miles an hour. Easy.
Definitely something to watch out for in the Keys. So we've talked about Rafael's path, the potential impacts on the Caribbean and the U.S. Gulf Coast, and even tornadoes. But I want to shift gears a bit and talk about the people who are affected by this.
Yeah, that's an important perspective.
For the people who live in these areas, this isn't just some abstract weather event. This is their life, you know.
Absolutely. This is a time of intense stress and anxiety for a lot of people.
I bet.
They're having to make tough decisions. Do they evacuate? Board up their homes? Stock up on supplies? And all while not knowing what the storm will do or how bad it will be.
It must be incredibly emotional and challenging.
It definitely is. And it's important to remember that even after the storm passes, things aren't magically back to normal. People may have to deal with damaged homes, power outages, flooding, and the emotional toll of going through something so stressful.
It's a good reminder that we can track the science of the storm, but we can't forget about the human impact.
Precisely. And that's why communities need to have strong support systems in place, both before and after a hurricane. Things like emergency plans, clear evacuation routes, accessible shelters, and access to food, water, and medical care can make a huge difference in helping people cope.
So it's not just about surviving the storm, it's about supporting each other through the entire experience, from preparing to recovering.
Exactly. And that sense of community and resilience is something that really shines through during these tough times.
Well said. Now, before we move on, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about human expertise in hurricane forecasting.
Yeah, that's so important.
You talked about how meteorologists use their knowledge and experience to figure out which model is most likely to be right. Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. So the models are really important. They give us a foundation for understanding where a hurricane might go and how strong it might get. But it's the meteorologists who actually make the call.
So they're like detectives using the models as clues, but also relying on their own experience to solve the case.
Exactly. It's all about careful analysis and interpretation.
And with all the uncertainty around Rafael's path, it must be extra challenging for them to make accurate forecasts.
Definitely. When you have a storm that just formed and is still days away from land, there's so many things that could happen. Small changes in the atmosphere or the storm itself can totally change its track and intensity.
So they're constantly monitoring and reevaluating the situation.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for people to stay up to date with the latest forecasts from trusted sources like the National Hurricane Center. Things can change fast.
Excellent advice. And I want to go back to something fascinating you mentioned earlier about how a hurricane's rain bands interacting with land can spawn tornadoes.
Oh, yeah. It's a phenomenon that often catches people off guard.
I'm curious, are there certain spots along the Gulf Coast that are more prone to those kinds of tornadoes?
That's a good question.
Mm.
And it turns out that the Gulf Coast's geography plays a big role. Well, first of all, the Gulf Coast is pretty flat and open, so there's more space for the hurricane's rain bands to interact with the land. There aren't many mountains or hills to block the wind and moisture, which makes it easier for tornadoes to form.
It's like a big open stage for them.
Exactly. And the way the coastline curves inward actually creates a kind of funnel that can concentrate the hurricane's energy and make tornadoes more likely.
So the coastline itself is helping to create these tornadoes.
Kind of. And when you add that to the warm, moist air that's always around the Gulf Coast, it's a recipe for some dangerous tornadoes.
So it's not just about preparing for the hurricane itself, it's about being ready for tornadoes too.
Right. Being aware of that threat can make all the difference when it comes to staying safe during a hurricane.
Well said. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into Tropical Storm Rafael, I want to ask you a bigger question. We've talked a lot about the uncertainty surrounding Rafael's path and intensity, the potential impacts on both the Caribbean and the Gulf Coast, and even the chance of tornadoes. But do you think there's anything we can learn from all this uncertainty?
That's a great question. I think there are definitely some important lessons we can take away from this.
Like what?
Well, I think it shows us that we need to be humble when it comes to predicting the weather. Even with all the fancy technology we have, we can't always know for sure what a storm will do.
So nature is still in charge and we can't always control it.
Exactly.
Right.
We also need to be adaptable and prepared for different things to happen. We can't always rely on one forecast to tell us exactly what will happen. We need to be ready to change our plans based on the latest information.
So being flexible and resilient is important.
Yes. And I think it also shows us how important community and collaboration are. When a hurricane threatens, it's not just about each person taking care of themselves. It's about working together to help everyone stay safe.
That's a powerful message. So as we move on to the next part of our deep dive, what's one key thought you'd like to leave our listener with?
Stay informed, be prepared, and don't underestimate the power of nature.
Wise words. And remember, even though there's a lot of uncertainty around Rafael right now, we'll keep an eye on things and give you updates as they come in. So stay tuned, and as always, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
You're welcome. It's amazing how much we've learned about hurricanes over the years.
Yeah.
It wasn't that long ago that we were using really basic tools to track these storms. And now we have satellites and computers and all these experts dedicated to understanding them.
It really is incredible how far we've come. I mean, what do you think is the biggest change in how we understand hurricanes?
I think it's how we've started to look at all the different things that can affect a hurricane's behavior.
Okay.
We're not just focused on wind speed and where it's going anymore. We're really digging into the science, looking at things like ocean temperatures, air currents, and even how the hurricane interacts with the land.
So it's like we've done from a flat picture of the storm to a 3D one.
Exactly. And that's helped us get a lot better at forecasting and figuring out what a hurricane might do.
It's amazing what we can do now. But even with all this technology like we're seeing with Rafael, there's still a lot of uncertainty when it comes to hurricanes. Nature is powerful and we're still learning.
That's so true. And that's why being prepared is so important, especially for people who live in hurricane zones.
So what does being prepared actually look like these days, when hurricanes can intensify so quickly, change direction, and even spawn tornadoes?
The most important thing is to have a plan before a storm even forms. Know your evacuation route, have a go bag ready, and stay up to date on the latest forecasts from the Hurricane Center or your local news.
So don't wait till the last minute.
Right? Be proactive. And it's not just about the practical stuff either. You need to be mentally and emotionally prepared too.
That's a good point. Hurricanes can be really stressful and even traumatic. It's important to be ready for that.
Absolutely. Having a good support system, whether it's family, friends, or community resources, can make a huge difference.
So preparedness is about the whole picture, the physical, the emotional, and the social aspects.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that hurricanes can affect us in many different ways and being ready for all of them.
As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I have a question that's been on my mind. With all the advances in technology like artificial intelligence and machine learning, what role do you think they'll play in how we understand and respond to hurricanes in the future?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's something the scientists are really excited about. AI and machine learning have the potential to completely change how we predict, prepare for, and react to hurricanes.
Can you give us an example of what that might look like?
Well, imagine AI systems that can look at tons of data from satellites, weather stations, and even social media to give us even better hurricane forecasts than we have now. Or AI that can help emergency responders plan evacuations and allocate resources more efficiently, potentially saving lives and reducing damage.
That sounds incredible. Like AI could really help us minimize the impact of these storms?
It definitely has the potential. But it's important to remember that technology is just a tool. It's up to us to use it responsibly and ethically.
For the good of everyone.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about climate change. This is something that's been in the news a lot lately, and for good reason. There's a lot of talk about how climate change is affecting hurricanes.
Yeah, it's a really important issue.
Yeah.
And the science is clear. Climate change is impacting hurricane activity, and it's having real consequences.
So can you explain the link between climate change and hurricanes?
Sure. So climate change is making the Earth's oceans warmer. And as we talked about before, warm ocean water is what fuels hurricanes. So as the ocean gets warmer, hurricanes have more energy to work with, which means they can become stronger.
So it's like climate change is making these storms even more powerful.
Right. And it's not just about intensity either. Climate change is also causing sea levels to rise, and that can make storm surge even worse.
Oh, wow. So even a weaker hurricane could cause more flooding and damage because the sea level is higher.
Exactly. Plus, warmer air can hold more moisture, so hurricanes can produce more rain, which increases the risk of flooding inland, too.
So it's like a triple whammy. More intense hurricanes, more flooding, and wider impacts because of climate change.
It's complicated, and there's still a lot we're learning. But the evidence is clear. Climate change is already affecting hurricanes, and these changes are likely to continue.
That's pretty sobering. So knowing that climate change is making hurricanes worse, what can we do to reduce the risks and make our communities more resilient?
That's the big question, and it's going to take a lot of effort on multiple fronts. On a global scale, we need to tackle the root of the problem by reducing greenhouse gas emissions and shifting to cleaner energy sources.
So addressing climate change itself is key.
Absolutely. But we also need to adapt to the changes that are already happening and get ready for more intense hurricanes in the future. That means things like making our buildings stronger, investing in flood control, and developing better warning systems.
So a global solution and local adaptations.
Exactly. And it's crucial that these efforts are inclusive and equitable. We need to make sure that everyone has the resources and support they need to prepare for and recover from hurricanes.
That's so important because climate change and hurricanes don't affect everyone equally. We need to make sure everyone has a chance to be resilient.
I agree. Building a more sustainable and resilient future for all of us means addressing both the environmental and social aspects of this problem.
Okay, so let's take a step back and look at the history of hurricanes in the Atlantic. This region has seen a lot of these powerful storms over the years.
It really has. There's a long and active history of hurricanes in the Atlantic. We have records going back centuries.
Are there any particular hurricanes from the past that really stand out to you as being particularly significant or impactful?
Well, there are definitely some that left a lasting mark on history. One that comes to mind is the Great Hurricane of 1780. It absolutely devastated the Caribbean islands of Barbados, Martinique, and St. Eustatius.
Yeah.
Killed tens of thousands of people.
Tens of thousands. Wow, that's hard to even imagine. It really shows you the power of these storms.
It does. And then there's the Galveston Hurricane of 1900. That one hit Galveston, Texas incredibly hard. Still the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. Somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people died.
It's important to remember those events, They remind us just how powerful hurricanes can be and how important it is to learn from the past so we can be better prepared in the future.
Absolutely. Studying past hurricanes helps us understand how they behave, track their patterns, and figure out where we're most vulnerable. It informs our forecasting models, our preparedness strategies, and ultimately it helps us save lives and reduce the impacts of these storms.
So we're using the past to guide us in the present and prepare for the future.
Exactly. The past holds valuable lessons for us.
Speaking of the past, let's go back to the issue of uncertainty in hurricane forecasting. We talked earlier about how even with our advanced models, there's always some level of unpredictability when it comes to these storms.
You're right. Uncertainty is just part of hurricane forecasting. It's something meteorologists deal with all the time.
I'm curious, what are some of the main things that make it so hard to predict hurricanes?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is that the atmosphere itself is chaotic. Tiny changes in things like temperature, pressure, and wind can have a domino effect and completely change a hurricane's path and intensity.
Kind of like the butterfly effect.
Exactly. And then we also have to deal with limitations in the data we have. Even though we have satellites, buoys, and weather stations all over the place, there are still gaps in our coverage, especially over the ocean where hurricanes form.
So it's like trying to solve a puzzle with some of the pieces missing.
Exactly. Those missing pieces can make it really hard to understand what's going on with the storm and how it might develop. And then there's the added complication of how hurricanes interact with land. Like we've talked about, land can disrupt a hurricane's circulation, weaken it, or even cause tornadoes. And those interactions can be really hard to predict accurately.
So it's like a hurricane is a pinball bouncing around inside a pinball machine.
That's a great way to put it. The point is, there are so many factors at play, and even small changes can throw off the entire forecast.
That makes sense. So if uncertainty is unavoidable, how do meteorologists explain that to the public in a way that's helpful and gives people something to act on?
That's a great question. Communication is key. Meteorologists use a bunch of tools to explain uncertainty. Things like probabilistic forecasts, which give you a range of possible outcomes with percentages and cone of uncertainty graphics, which show you the area where the hurricane might go.
So they're giving people a bigger picture, acknowledging that they don't know everything, and showing the range of possibilities instead of just one prediction.
Exactly. And they also emphasize that no matter what the forecast says, people need to be prepared. Even if the storm is likely to miss your area, there's always a chance it could change course.
So hope for the best, but prepare for the worst.
Right, and stay informed. Follow the advice of your local authorities. They know the risks in your area and can give you the best guidance.
Excellent advice. Okay, so there's been a lot of talk lately about hurricanes rapidly intensifying. We've seen it happen with a few recent storms, and it's making scientists and forecasters pretty nervous.
Yeah, it's definitely a worrying trend, and we're studying it closely. Rapid intensification is when a hurricane's wind speeds increase by at least 35 miles per hour within a 24-hour period.
Wow, it's a huge jump in a short amount of time. Why is this happening more often?
Well, scientists think that climate change is a big factor. Warmer ocean water gives hurricanes more fuel to intensify quickly.
So climate change is making these rapid intensifications more likely.
It seems that way. And it's not just the ocean temperatures. Other things like changes in the atmosphere can also play a role.
I bet that makes it even harder for forecasters to predict these storms. It can happen so fast.
Exactly. Rapid intensification can catch people off guard because it can happen in just a few hours. It's hard to give people enough warning.
So it's like this sudden burst of energy that can take everyone by surprise.
Right. And that's why it's so important to stay up to date on the latest forecasts and be ready to act quickly if a hurricane is coming your way, especially if there's a chance of rapid intensification.
Okay, so as we start to wrap up our deep dive, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the human impact of these storms. They can be devastating both in the short term and the long term.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that behind all the science and the data, there are real people whose lives are turned upside down by these storms.
When you see those images on the news of flooded homes, destroyed communities, and people who have lost everything, it's a stark reminder of the human cost of hurricanes.
It is.
Yeah.
And the impact can last long after the storm is gone. People can face long-term health problems, economic hardship, and displacement from their homes and communities.
So it's not just about riding out the storm. It's about helping those affected put their lives back together.
Exactly. And that support can look like a lot of different things, from financial aid and housing to emotional support and mental health services.
It's times like these that really show how important community is. We need to help each other through these tough times.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's change gears a bit and talk about how geography affects hurricanes and their impact.
Geography plays a huge role. It influences everything from how hurricanes form to where they go, how strong they get, and how much damage they cause.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Well, the most obvious one is the role of warm ocean water in hurricane formation. Hurricanes need water that's at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit to form and get stronger. That's why we usually see them forming in tropical areas where the ocean is warm enough.
So the ocean temperature determines where these storms can even get started.
Exactly. And once a hurricane forms, its path is guided by large-scale weather patterns like steering currents. These currents are like rivers of air that flow through the atmosphere, and they can push hurricanes in certain directions, either toward land or away from it.
So the atmosphere is like a highway system for hurricanes.
That's a good way to think about it. And then when a hurricane gets close to land, the shape of land can have a big impact on its intensity. Like we talked about before, mountains and hills can break up. A hurricane weaken it and even cause tornadoes. But flat coastal areas don't offer much resistance. So those areas tend to see more flooding and damage.
So the land can either protect us from a hurricane or make it worse.
Right. And even small differences in the coastline can make a big difference. For example, a narrow inlet or bay can funnel storm surge inland, causing much higher water levels than in the surrounding areas.
It's amazing how geography can shape the behavior and impact of these storms.
It really is. And understanding those geographical factors is really important for predicting hurricane tracks and intensity and for helping communities prepare.
Well said. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listener with a final thought. We've talked a lot about the science of hurricanes, the challenges of predicting them, the influence of climate change, and the importance of being prepared. But I think it's also important to remember how awe-inspiring these storms are.
That's a great point. While we need to respect the destructive power of hurricanes and protect ourselves from them, we can also appreciate their incredible power and beauty.
From the swirling clouds you see in satellite images to the massive waves crashing on the shore, hurricanes are a testament to the incredible energy of our planet.
They remind us that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves, and that while we can try to understand and predict these forces of nature, we also need to acknowledge our place within them.
Okay, so let's move on to the final part of our deep dive. We're going to talk about some of the cutting-edge research and new technologies that are shaping the future of hurricane science and forecasting. We've talked about a lot with Tropical Storm Rafael. The science behind hurricanes, how tricky it is to predict them, and the huge impact they have on people and the environment. But before we wrap up, I'm curious about the future. What are some of the really cool advancements or new technologies in hurricane research and forecasting that have you excited?
Oh, there's some really incredible stuff happening right now. Things that could totally change how we understand and predict hurricanes.
Like what? What are you most interested in?
One thing that I find fascinating is using drones to collect data inside hurricanes.
Drones, really?
Yeah, they can fly right into the middle of the storm and measure things like wind speed, pressure, temperature, humidity, all that stuff.
Wow, so it's like having storm chasers, but without the risk to human life.
Exactly. And the data from those drones can be used to make our forecasts even better.
That's amazing. It's like having eyes inside the storm itself.
Yeah.
What other new technologies are making a big difference in hurricane research?
AI and machine learning are also showing huge potential. They can analyze mountains of data from satellites, radar, and other sources to find patterns and trends that we might miss.
So they're like super smart assistants helping our human forecasters.
Exactly. They can spot subtle changes in a hurricane that could mean it's going to get stronger or change direction. And that early warning can give people more time to prepare.
These are some incredible advancements. It feels like we're entering a whole new world of hurricane science and forecasting. But as we wrap up our deep dive into Tropical Storm Rafael and hurricanes in general, what are some key things you want our listeners to remember?
The most important thing is to be prepared. Hurricanes are powerful, and we need to respect that. But if we understand them and stay informed and have a plan, we can make a huge difference in reducing the risk and building stronger communities.
And it's not just about preparing as individuals, right? It's about working together as a community to support each other.
Absolutely. Hurricanes often bring out the best in people. Neighbors helping neighbors, volunteers, providing aid, communities coming together to rebuild. It's a powerful reminder of our shared humanity.
It's true. Even in the face of disaster, there's strength and unity and hope. Well, we've covered a lot today, from the science behind hurricanes to the importance of being prepared and the incredible human spirit that shines through in tough times. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive and for sharing your expertise with us.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, stay safe, stay curious, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive